Behind me is the Abbey of Oros, which for over 500 years was the sort of seat of power for the Jomardai family. The story here begins around the 820s when the Benedictines moved in to the pass right up over behind this abbey. Now, around the late 13th century, this church burned down and they relocated to right where we're now standing, or in this immediate area. And by the time Pal Dukagjini came along, he was an incredibly beloved prince, and he controlled the area of northern Albania from around Lecce up to the area of the central plains of Kosovo, which was called the Dukagjini Plain. Pal Dukagjini was a close associate of Skanderbeg and worked with him in the League of Lecce. Skanderbeg actually said of Pal Dukagjini that if we had half a dozen men like him, then our country could be an empire. Now, eventually, Pal Dukagjini would pass away, but his son, Leke Dukagjini, named after his brother Leke, would go on to have a controversial but no less celebrated history. Decades after his death, chronicler Martin Berletti wrote that Prince Pal Dukagjini was the most beloved man in the north of Albania, and that a bust was still visible of him 50 years later in Prizren, which is in the center of Kosovo. Now, if you take a look at some of the historic artifacts that were associated with this church, you will find a silver cross that was dedicated by Pal Dukagjini in 1447, some years before his death. He was a very close patron of this abbey, and because of his blood relations to the Jomardai family, they maintained this as their base of spiritual influence throughout all of Mirdit. By the way, that cross was lost to looters during the wars, but on the cross, photos exist, was marked 7 August 1447 by the order of Lord Pal Dukagjini during the era of the already mentioned Lord Piero Duca, made by the Niska Adamovic. Now, Niska was a very well-known craftsman from the city of Ragusa, which lent much of its power to patrons of this abbey. Idea here is that a direct blood relative of Prince Pal Dukagjini, who was beloved by all in this region, was John Markai, the first in the lineage of John Markais who would come to control this region and really make the area around here their base of operations, their sort of headquarters. So you can look across this cemetery and see many people buried right here in the shadow of the church. Now, unfortunately, the church was destroyed under the regime of Enver Hoxha, but was later rebuilt. It's worth noting that the first Catholic order to find its way to the area of Mirdita were the Benedictines around the 820s when they built that abbey up over the mountains here. However, around the end of the 13th century it burned down and the authority passed to the Franciscans, who helped to build another one right where we're standing. Eventually that would burn down around the late 17th century, and then the one that we see constructed here is a pretty faithful recreation to it. The history we have to go through to get to the conversation about Leshie Z is a long and fascinating one. Now, I won't tell the entire stories of all the Kapidans before him, but you need to understand that there was a man named Prank Leshe who took the title when his father, Leshie Joni, passed away. He was the eldest of Leshie's 3 sons, but in 1815 he would die while fighting in Montenegro. Now, Leshie's eldest son, Dode Prenga, was another leader who would have taken over had he not been poisoned by the Turks in 1828 before he really had enough time to cement his rule. Pring Leshie's second son, Nicol, was still very young, so the title, the regency, passed to his uncle, Leshie Z, who was very widely considered to be an excellent leader, but absolutely ruthless. And this much was recognized by the Ottomans, who almost immediately sent him into exile. Now, at the time in the Ottoman Empire, there were 2 separate sort of geopolitical entities in Albania, one led by Ali Pasha Tepelena to the far south. The one up around Shkodër was a separate polity that would oftentimes feud with Ali Pasha. Now, Leshie Z was semi in exile, semi also in the area of southern Albania, aiding Ali Pasha Tepelena, where he led the personal bodyguard, about 300 soldiers. In any case, while he was gone, the Ottoman authorities up around Shkodër convinced the man that filled his shoes while he was away, they convinced him that if he killed 3 sons of Leshizi that he would be able to seize power for himself. Naturally, once this happened, in 1836, the Ottomans released him from his service down with Ali Pasha Tepelena, and he returned up here to settle the score. Church authorities immediately recognized the possibility of a massacre taking place. So they said, let bygones be bygones, and so long as your nephew is now just following you without question and recognizes your authority, Leshizi's authority, as the regent of Mirdita, then all will be well. Well, according to family genealogy, he didn't recognize the authority of Leshizi, and by 1836, Leshizi actually killed him. Within a year, Leshizi would be killed by that man's companions, and a massacre would follow, which nearly wiped out both sides of the family and made it so that the Jean-Marcai family was nearly extinct in this region. However, his elder brother had another son who was able to carry on that lineage, and during these massacres, 22 different people from 2 districts were killed. However, 2 of them, his direct descendants, were able to be smuggled out of the community in a box. When Leshizi was killed, after his 3 sons had already been murdered, there was a direct descendant who survived. The chief representative of the elder branch, the son of Leshizi's older brother, was Bib Doda, and he would later go on to be recognized as a chief of the tribe.
Yeah, he was a hero, but yes, he was poisoned, as was Prembi Doda was murdered in Leja. Bib Doda was poisoned by a woman here from Shkodra.
Oh, I thought he was poisoned by the Ottomans.
Well, I don't know if they put her up to it, but that's how he was poisoned. Yeah, there's a lot of murders and deaths.
And to find Leshizi's grave, it's over here on the left side of the cemetery in front of the Abbey of Arash. If you take a look at the left grave here, it's black, but there's a small plaque there. It's buried over the top of Leshizi. This is the old convent behind the Abbey of Arash. It had a library, and students who would come from abroad would stay inside of the tower houses of the family up in the village on the slopes of the hill. And after a while, they would come down in here. This was sort of a religious learning center overlooking the valley. And if you keep going west of here, you'll hit the ocean. I should also point out that this wasn't just a religious school. It was run by the priests, but it was also secular. So you could learn to speak Albanian, math, history. It was a school just like any other, except it was here in the mountains of northern Albania. I'd like to talk a little bit about Marco Gioni, but before I can really get to his story, I need to detail some of the leaders and capidans of Mirdit who came before him. One of those leaders was a man named Leshizi, who in 1833 built the Sarayet of the family, which was their sort of base of power, pretty close to the Abbey of Arash. Now, Leshi was killed in 1837 in the midst of a family feud which was fanned by the Ottomans, who wanted the family to wipe itself out. Was he sent into exile, or did he go south to be the commander of the bodyguard of Ali Pasha Tepelena?
He did go into exile, and while he was there, his 3 sons were killed. When he came back, he took revenge. Blood feud. And ultimately, his nephew killed him.
The grandson of his second eldest brother, a man named Bib Doda, succeeded him as Capitan of Mirdit. Now this is because his father and his grandfather had both died, and later on Bib Doda's own brother would likewise be killed. Bib Doda was a man of exceptional leadership, and everybody surrounding the family, including the Ottomans, realized they had 2 main attributes. Firstly, they had exceptional honor, and they would serve anybody faithfully if they were called to do so. And secondly, they desired true self-rule. They were a family and a region unto themselves, and they didn't necessarily want the meddling of outside forces. Even so, because of their honor, when Bib-Dota was called to serve the Ottomans, he became a war hero. And this service at the Battle of Sevastopol would follow him, and he got accolades from all across Europe. But in the early 1860s, during the Ottoman-Montenegrin War, the French, under Napoleon III, tried to foment rebellion among the Albanians, turning them against the Ottomans. Initially, Bib-Dota was the man who was supposed to raise the Albanian flag, but he was a pragmatist and realized that even if they were able to push out the Ottomans, their own forces would have been weakened, so he decided to sit that rebellion out. Now, this was unpopular among some people, and in 1868 he was assassinated, and the position of Capidan fell to his young son, Prang Bib-Dota, who immediately was looked at by the Ottomans as a possible threat, because again, this family had exceptional leadership, but they also had a unique culture all their own.
This here is Prang Bib-Dota in his younger days, and this is him later on. Then this here is Capitan Marcagioni, my great-grandfather, who became heir to Prang Bib-Dota because he had no children. So, and his line basically ended.
You mentioned a little bit about Prang Bib-Dota, how he was betrayed and exiled, and he really does seem to have a fascinating story.
Yeah, he does. His is a whole other story. I think I also have a couple books from him too. Yeah, he has a whole other story. He was a strong personality.
Wasn't he a Catholic pasha?
Well, he was taken when he was 8, and he kind of grew up, there. And so, yeah, he learned a lot about being a Muslim, but he came back and he was a Catholic, They took him as another effort to distance and break up the family. They figured they had him castrated so that he wouldn't have any heirs. And he didn't have any heirs, but he did have cousins, so.
The Ottomans looked at the family as a real threat to their regional power, and after Prang Bib-Dota was betrayed and exiled, Marcagioni assumed leadership in 1883. It should be remembered that the only actual Capitan at that time was Prang, but because he was living in exile, Marcagioni acted more as a regent. Now, he moved south, and when he was gone, the Turks had Dode Gega, a major in the Ottoman military, appoint a distant family relative, the elderly Prang Kol Pranga, the new deputy governor of the region. Now, people actually liked Prang, but he was old, and everybody realized that the Turks only wanted a leader who was easy to control. Marcagioni dispatched his brother Dua to kill the Ottoman major who had appointed him, Gega, and came back to fill the shoes once more. Once he was in Orash, Marcagioni ordered the construction of 18 new towers to protect the abbey, fearing that the Ottomans would come back in force. Now, after Zog became the prime minister of Albania in 1920, he began a campaign against Mirdit. Marcagioni organized a rebellion and declared himself president, but very soon their sovereignty was ended. After the death of his father, Capitan Mark, his son, John, resolved to solve hundreds of blood feuds, and this is where many of those were solved in the valley towards the westernmost fringes of Mirdit in the early and mid-1920s. We're looking over the valley now, and if you follow this river back to the ocean, it's only about 30 minutes to the coast by car.
And what got me really interested when I was a kid, being a half Albanian, half American kid, was like, what's the special thing about being Albanian? So I started out with learning, Indo-European language. It's a very ancient one. It's possibly the most ancient surviving Indo-European branch. It's its own unique one. So I identified, okay, it's a very ancient language. Okay, well now you have ancient customs. And so what is the ancient customs? They're encoded in this code of Lectogagini, this customary code. And this guy, who I was mentioning before, this professor, doctor, this Japanese guy, I think he was originally like a medical doctor. He left that because he wanted to follow his own passion. Obviously, he's being that he's Japanese. He has his own interest in his own ancient culture. He started drawing parallels between the code of ethics in the, not ninja, what is it? The
Bushido.
Bushido.
That's literally
Thank you.
the next question I was going to ask you. We're thinking on the same wavelength.
Right, exactly, yes. So he was trying to make the connection, just an interesting, like, what, if this is an ancient culture, and also I derive from an ancient culture, what are some things that are similar between the two?
So John that followed Mark, so his son, his biggest son. One of his first actions was to, let's say, to reconciliate the families who were in blood feud in Mirdit. So one of his first actions, let's say, as a captain. Of course. Because by Kanun, the oral tradition of the Albanians, the Jomargo family was, let's say, the highest in the hierarchy of ruling, let's say, and every dispute, if it would not get a solution in the councils of elders, let's say, the last word would be from the leader of the Jomargo family. So this is how Mirdit was organized.
The prefecture used to be there, and this is where they usually go to have meetings, and they held a big meeting for the Besa in 1928. I think that's in the book too.
I think that was in Shenpali,
Yeah.
outside of Spal.
Spal is Shenpali.
Oh.
St. Paul, it means.
Actually, standing right here by the church, you can see the ocean. Most of the information I get for this video comes from this excellently written book, I couldn't recommend it enough, by Bianca Jomarkai. Now you might want to take a look at that surname, Jomarkai. A lot of the characters in this story have a surname or a middle and last name, Marcagioni. This led a lot of people in recent times to assume that the family was the Marcagioni family. In reality, they are descendants of Jomarkai, who was a close associate of Skanderbeg, and because of this, they were resolved to actually mediate feuds that couldn't be fixed in a council of elders. As Bianca herself describes, this created a system in which the people of the highlands of Albania in the far north, the Catholic chiefs and the Muslims, they were all basically equals, with the Kapidan as the first among equals. So the author of this book, Bianca Jomarkai, is actually the granddaughter of Capitan John Marcagioni, and in describing the activities of Capitan John, Bianca writes, quote, "He understood what the era demanded and did not hesitate to make changes to the extremely ancient Kanun." She points out, very interestingly, that the Kanun held all fabrics of civilization together, not just the Catholics and Christians, but also the Muslims and every person in the highlands of Albania. This was a living, verbal, self-governing agreement that was codified but very often changed, and because his father, Capitan Mark, had died in 1925, John felt that he must immediately prove himself, and he did so in 1926 by resolving 360 blood feuds in this region. Then, the following year, he resolved another 260, and sort of as a final move to seal the deal, he had a sort of convention here at the church in Shenpali, where he invited dozens of representatives from the local Muslim tribes, and they all agreed to conform to the Kanun and bound their agreement with a handshake, the Code of Besa. He had dozens of Muslim elders shake hands to conform with the Besa. It was a faithful pledge. Where did their faith come from that they would stick to the Kanun if they had a different religion? Can faith and honor and religion be separated?
Well, before anything, Albanians are Albanian. They don't consider themselves, oh, I'm a Catholic Albanian, I'm a Muslim. Not at the time anyway. It's a little bit different now, but before anything, they're all Albanian. So I don't even think that came into play. If they were from Mirdita and they followed the Kanun, they were Mirditori, they weren't, I'm Muslim, I'm not going to follow you because the chief is Catholic. That didn't work like that. So if you were from Mirdita, that was your culture, that was your livelihood, that was your history, that you were Mirditori.
So there was no swearing on the Bible or the Quran, it was swearing on your honor.
Yeah, on your honor.
Right, your word. That's the spirit.
That's the word, Besa. That's your word. That's what that means.
This meeting took place here in 1928, and the stated goal of Capitan John was to renew the covenant of the Besa, a code of honor. He invited 5 bayraks, or flag bearers of the Highland Muslim tribes, and within a few days, 25 of their comrades showed up, and they sealed their agreement. And hearing news of this, Zog, who was the leader of Albania at the time, exempted this region from taxes. He was very appreciative of the law enforcement in such a lawless area of Albania. Well, one of the things you mentioned was Shimpali.
Yeah.
And I just went there yesterday. Was that chosen because it was symbolic, because you could sort of see the ocean and then you could also see the valleys? Was there a special significance?
I was going to answer that because Shimpali, St. Paul,
Yeah.
who was St. Paul?
Yeah.
St. Paul was the first apostle.
Stone, yeah. St. Paul, the Peter, St. Paul.
Yeah. Essentially, I spent this past summer in Armenia, and Armenians are known as the first Christian nation to accept Christianity. Yeah, the first nation to accept Christianity. But it's quite possible that the Illyrians were the first people in Europe to accept Christianity. And it's probably through St. Paul. At least where it says in the Bible that he traveled through, from up around, went through Anatolia and stopped off in Durrës. So I'm wondering if that's even that's the significance of it.
It'd be fascinating to do some archaeological work around Shimpali, right?
Yeah, there are.
I'm sure you'd find something.
Yeah, there's probably something there.
After declaring himself king of Albania, Ahmet Zogu demanded to meet with the Highlanders and the chieftains of their tribes. The first man he demanded to meet by name was Capitan John Marcagione, and so impressed with his leadership was Ahmet Zogu that he declared him a lieutenant colonel. Essentially, he was holding now the rank of military governor. Now, did Capitan John sit back and allow his rank to get to his head? No. The first decision that he made was to erect a school on top of the ruins of the palace of Leshi İzi, who was a previous Capitan. This palace had been destroyed by the Ottomans, and that school is still in use today. By 1930, he was recognized as a powerful figure by the Catholic Church and invited to the Vatican, where he had an audience with the Pope. He then met with representatives of the Italian government, and by 1939 he was again invited back to Italy, where he was made a senator of the Kingdom of Italy. This also coincided with the Italian invasion of Albania. By the mid-1930s, many of the Capitan's family had been educated in Italy. They maintained a steady correspondence with the Vatican and with Rome, and when the Italians invaded in 1939, they saw their work with the new government not as the collaboration of a Vidkun Quisling type figure who only worked with outside powers he'd never worked with before for power and fame. Those were two things that the Capitan already had. They thought that working with this new government would bring in a new era of prosperity, something that they wanted to work towards because this region of Albania was incredibly poor and there was nobody else around to help them. Now, this was, of course, viewed with scorn by the communist government of Enver Hoxha, and according to Bianca, even having a surname associated with the Gjomarkai family would get you nothing but arbitrary arrest, derision, bullying. Even as children in schools, they were taught that the whole family was nothing but fascist Quisling figures, and to this day, the pages of Albania's history do not teach very well about the Gjomarkai family. I'm wondering how your family viewed this as it was happening, how the Italians were pushed out and the Germans came in.
Well, you have to remember that my family in Mirdita very autonomous. So their main interest was maintaining Mirdita's culture, Mirdita's history. And they didn't, it's not that they were against the king, but they weren't for the king. You know, they were kind of neutral in that way. And when Italy came in, they, they were friends with Italians. I mean, the history between Albania and Italy goes on for centuries. So they welcomed them. Then the tide started to turn and the Germans came in, but at the same time, Hoxha was building up. So it gets a little iffy because it's either you go with the communists that you know what they're going to do, and they are not the solution to what they wanted to do, Or you go with the Germans, who were basically losing the war anyway, because it was the end of 1944.
So it wasn't they immediately went over to the Germans and were
it's not
happy.
like, no, and it's not like they took on, their uniforms and that's Hail Hitler. It wasn't anything like that. But they did, not fight them. They basically wanted to get along so they could do their thing for Mirdita. Right. So it was like the lesser of the two evils, and that's what people don't really understand, because they call them collaborators, and they weren't collaborators. They were just kind of a neutral zone, and they were trying to maintain their life, their culture, their history the way it had been for the last 500 years.
And the same church where the Covenant of the Besa was reaffirmed in 1928 between the Muslim Bayraks and the Catholic chieftains under Capitan John Marcagione, was destroyed by the communists under Enver Hoxha. The original church probably would have been down on this sort of outcropping. Some of those stones might have belonged to it. And you can see here in the village that is, I believe, a local kulla, a tower house, a fortified home that would have been used in times of Highland warfare.
Then after Marcagione, this is him too, when he's a little bit older. He died in 1925, and that's my grandfather, John Marcagione, so he became the Capitan. That's his national Albanian costume from Mirdita. And he was Capitan from 1925 until the day he died in 1968 in Italy. That's a whole other story. And it also tells you about the House of Giomarco. The House of Giomarco
And
is the foundation of the Qanun. So it occupies the place of honor on all occasions, all assemblies. It may not be placed under ban. It may not be destroyed. It may not be expelled from the country. Cases may not be appealed beyond this house. It has the right to gather together the chiefs and the people in general assemblies. Whenever it deems it necessary, it has the right to send heralds to summon a man from each house throughout the land and to gather them together as St. Paul, Shempali. In every case of judgment, it has the right to the last word. It has the right to destroy and to expel from the country. It has the right to condemn to death. The limbs belong to the clans, the heads to Giomarco.
I like that.
It has the right to deprive of presidents and chieftainship anyone who intrigues against or betrays the country. These honors, however, may not be given to someone outside the brotherhood, since they are inherited rights. It has the right to a portion of every fine. It has the right to 500 grosh, which is beans, right? Grosh, for every murder committed. Before being tried by the chiefs and the people of the clans for breaking the law, a member of the house must submit a pledge. If he is found guilty, he must answer for his crime in accordance with the Qanun. He must submit to a fine like any other citizen. When a general amnesty is declared, the house has the right to 2 meals provided by the people. If a member of this house is needed as a junior, his oath is considered to be equivalent to that of 12 jurors selected by the accused. In war, the house has the right of precedence and command. For crimes punishable by the burning of one's home, this house is scraped with a file, a symbolic gesture. So it just goes on. The House of Giomarco has its own chapter.
Sorry for the less than formal ending to this video, but I thought I'd go over some Albanian folklore which may help to explain how the Giomarco family came across so much authority when it comes to enforcing Qanun. I'd also like to read some excerpts from a book by Bianca's father, the Mirdita House of Giomarco Qanun, one of those more modern interpretations of Qanun that we've been discussing. Now this story begins in the time of Skander Beg, the military genius who led the League of Lege, one of the early modern medieval Albanian states. This league was composed of Albanian noblemen, mostly scattered across the north. Now, on an evening, Skanderbeg was hosting a party for one of his daughters. He invited quite a few noblemen to this party, and some of them brought along their daughters. One of the men invited was Prince Pal Dukagjini, who was incredibly influential in controlling the Dukagjini Plains, which stretch from northern Albania into Kosovo, into the lowlands of Kosovo. However, Prince Pal was a little bit elderly, so he invited his two sons, Prince Lek Dukagjini, who was more level-headed but very quick to fall in love, along with Lek's brother Nicholas Dukagjini, who was very quick to get into a fight to defend the honor of his family. Along with them was Prince Lek Zaharia, who was also very quick to fall in love, and was a close personal friend of Skanderbeg, the leader of the League of Lege. And then comes to the party Princess Irene Dushmani. Both Lek Dukagjini and Lek Zaharia are competing for Princess Dushmani's attention, and she seems to be reciprocating mostly to Prince Zaharia. Pretty soon, Lek Dukagjini says, "I feel that any union between Zaharia and Dushmani would weaken the League of Lege and cause internal fighting among many of the younger princes, most of whom are very interested in Princess Dushmani." Naturally, Prince Lek Zaharia steps forward and says, "You only have an interest in sabotaging a relationship between us." So the two begin to fight, and Nicholas Dukagjini steps forward and begins to savagely beat Prince Lek Zaharia. However, the fight is broken up, and the badly wounded Zaharia shakes hands with Lek Dukagjini, and they all agree to let bygones be bygones. After all, this is honor. They put the past behind them, but at some point it seems like Lek Zaharia did contact Venice, it might have even been before the fight, and told them that if anything should befall him, he was loyal to Venice, so his fort should go to the Venetians. Now, not too long after, even though the Dukagjini and Zaharia families had patched things up, Lek Zaharia was assassinated. Many people blamed Lek Dukagjini, and one of these people who blamed Lek was Skanderbeg himself, because he was a very close friend of Zaharia. Now, naturally, Lek looked at this, and some modern historians look at this and say, perhaps his more hot-tempered brother Nicholas killed Lek Zaharia. No matter what the case was, Lek Dukagjini knew that now that the leader of the League of Lege was after him, he was eyeing the fort of Zaharia because he needed to retreat somewhere. This fort naturally fell to the Venetians, and the plot of Lek Dukagjini to take the fort was uncovered. He was forced to call off the operation. After a little while, the Ottomans came in and took the fort, and Lek Dukagjini was very happy to push them out, and in these celebrations, the Venetian soldiers very soon realized that Lek Dukagjini was outnumbering them. And to protect them, he took the Venetian commander's wife and children into his own custody. And it was clear to everyone involved that this was more or less a bargaining chip so that he and his soldiers could take control of that fort to protect him against any reprisals by Skanderbeg, who wanted possibly to avenge the death of his friend Lek Zaharia. Now, this was all a misunderstanding. It was probably somebody else, or it could have been his brother Nicholas acting outside of the agreement that both Lek Zaharia and Lek Dukagjini had. In any case, he was trying to defend himself. Now, eventually, the Pope sent somebody to patch things up, to get Skanderbeg and the Dukaginis to sit down and talk things through. This worked for a little while, but eventually, the Venetians, as well as Skanderbeg, tried to attack the fort that Lek Dukagjini was in, and he was forced to join with the Ottomans. Very quickly, however, he realized that this was a poor decision and went back to Skanderbeg, who welcomed him with open arms because Skanderbeg knew that this decision was genuine. Now, pretty soon, you would have many of his brothers, Lek Dukagjini's brothers, joining forces with the Ottomans, and the Ottomans seemed to be here to stay. This continued up until 1912, when the Albanian independence movement finally forced the Ottomans out of the territory. This was something that the Ducagini family felt was a stain on their lineage. They always held a hatred, a deep-seated resentment to the Ottomans who exploited a feud that had begun in the time of Skanderbeg to divide the families. Now, you may be wondering where this incorporates the Giomarchi family. Well, see, the leader of the Ducagini family was Prince Pal Ducagini.
Well, it was after Pal Ducagini, then you had the John Marco. When John Marco was the Capitan, that was the most prominent one. That's where we come from, John Marco, because he had a couple of sons, Pal Ducagini. But we're all descendants of John Marco. And at that time, it was all had to do with the battles against the Turks. That's what led them to their popularity. And they held a house together.
Forged in the fire of the Ottomans.
Yeah, it's always been against the Ottomans. And it's all been because they wanted to keep the religion safe. And they have. There wouldn't be Catholics up in the north if it wasn't for our house.
He was succeeded by Mark Cole Pal Ducagini, who was followed by John Mark Cole Pal Ducagini, the man from whom the name Giomarcu is taken, John Mark Cole Giomarcu, the lineage of the princes of Mirdit. 4 Capitans later came the rule of Leshy Ez, who we just finished talking about. And although every branch of the family has a history like this, very few pages are recorded.
So the people that were in prison were my dad and my grandfather went into exile. Mark and Lesh were fighting in the mountains. My uncle Deda, my uncle Nicola were arrested and taken into camps and prisons. My 2 aunts, Marta and Barda, along with Mark's wife, Marta, and his 3 children, Christina, Celestina, and John. And my grandmother, Dava, John Marcagioni's mother. So they were all arrested in 1945, carted off to, first place was Berat. They lived there for a while. And while there, they also sent my Aunt Barta to prison, arrested my Aunt Marta. She spent 3 years in jail, tortured her, and then released them, and in 1949 they were taken to Tepelena, which was the worst concentration camp in Albania. Dozens of children died there daily. Dysentery, they weren't fed, it was cold because it's in a valley and the wind was horrible. They were forced to carry wood up the hills on foot to the officers' homes. It was awful, it was really awful. So they were there until about 1954-55, and then they were sent to Luzhnya, and they were sent to different war camps there, and that's where they stayed until 1991.
Behind us is the small Catholic church here in Spal, which is the last battle of Dua, the son of Capitan John Marcagioni. We're actually going to be speaking to Bianca, Dua's daughter. This church is actually a fairly recent addition. The communists destroyed the original one, but this was erected during democracy. Now, the story here is that on October 20th, they were surrounded by the forces of Mehmet Shehu, who was Enver Hoxha's right-hand man. He was often considered to be the man next in line to succeed him, but he was killed mysteriously in 1981 in what almost everybody thinks was an assassination. At that point, Enver Hoxha was a little bit paranoid. In any case, this battle absolutely pummeled this village, and Shehu kept his troops waiting over at Orash, intending to fully sweep in and take the small community as soon as the lines of the Mountain Committee had been sufficiently weakened. However, after 3 days of heavy fighting, Dua managed to break out of the encirclement, and although he wanted to continue fighting, he had to rendezvous with his father, John Marcagioni, in Shkodra. There, the Capitan said the only way we keep our bloodline alive as Capitans is to go to Italy. So they coordinated with the leader of Bali Kombatar and got a vessel to take them over to the Italians.
My dad went into exile with my grandfather in 1944, eventually arriving in Italy, where we stayed until 1971 and then immigrated to the U.S. My uncle was arrested with the rest of the family in 1945, and they were taken to the Tepelena concentration camp. and he escaped in 1949 from there with 9 other friends, and eventually made his way into Yugoslavia, ultimately into Italy, and he joined my father and my grandfather in Rome. Then he settled in Germany for a few years, and in the late 60s he went to New York. My uncle Deda was arrested in 1945 as well, and he spent around 15 years in prisons, different prisons. Ultimately was sent to the concentration camp in Lushnia and joined the rest of the family, who had been interned since 1945 and remained interned until 1991.
And there is the modern town of Spal, but if I were to place bets on where this battle actually happened, it would probably be in the old fortified homes right down here. Either there or there. And this is overlooking the town of Spal, which is where Dua had his final battle before leaving for Italy with his father. So I was also looking into your book about your father and his last battle in Spal. Did he ever really talk about his days?
No.
He didn't. He just kept quiet about
he
it.
wrote it all. He wrote it all down, and no, he never really talked about him fighting the 5 months that he fought up in Mirdita. No, vaguely, like in general, but he never specifically. He didn't want to talk about it with us anyway, because I don't know. We were young, so no, he never really expressed any of that. I found out a lot of stuff through his papers. These are all. I have all these documents from, that he left, and when I was going through all of those papers, I found the diary of when he left Albania and his journey through Yugoslavia, Austria, reaching Italy with my grandfather.
Did he ever feel any remorse?
Actually, I think I did ask him once, did you ever kill anybody? He just said, I don't want to talk about it. So, I'm sure he did. It's not something he wanted to do, kill his fellow Albanians. But that was the way it was. They had to protect their culture and their country against. They knew what communism was going to do. They foresaw that. So.
Meanwhile, his brothers, Mark and Lesh, both stayed behind to fight. Mark would die in 1946, and Lesh 1 year later. Mark founded the Committee of the Mountains and died in, I believe, 1946, with the shootout with the Sigurimi. Does anyone know who betrayed him and where he's buried?
Take the lead. So the 13th of June 1946, in Prosek, which is a village in Mirdit, Mark was wounded, let's say, one of these confronts with the Sigurimi. One of his co-warriors was killed, but and the communists didn't realize which of who was Mark, and this is why he got wounded. Others that were with him, they took him and transported him back and went in the woods. When the communists were closing on their side, he killed him. So his body was, after the Sigurimi killed, let's say, kept him, they brought him to Spal, to the administrative. They wanted, let's say, to make an example of him. This is why they moved it from Mirdit, and from Mirdit they sent it to Shkodër. His body sent it to Shkodër, and later he says that they throw it to the river Kir. His body was thrown to the river Kir, so unfortunately he doesn't have a grave.
This is his first son, my uncle Mark, Kapitan John Marko. He was the leader of the Albanian anti-communist resistance, which actually began from Shkodra. This is my father, Nuit John Marko, This is my uncle Nicola, and my uncle Deda, and my uncle Sander.
Are they all here?
No, not Mark and Sander are here, because their bodies were lost, but they put them here as a symbol. But everybody else is here.
By 1947, most of the Mountain Committee and local insurgents against the communists had coalesced around Lech after his brother Mark had been killed the previous year. So on the 9th of August, 1947, local communist militias captured a member of this resistance movement, and under torture, he said that the movement was hiding in the village of Giziki right here behind me. We have the reconstructed church, which was destroyed during the Hoxha era, and after a 6-hour-long fight at the House of Gera, which was another prominent local family in Mirdit, they managed to kill Lech, as well as Marko Gera, the son of the House of Gera, along with several other members of his family, and thus ended the lives of the 2 sons of the Marcojoni family who continued the fight here in the mountains of Mirdit. But the fight of the Mountain Committee would go on up until they killed Bardhawk Biba in 1949, after which many of the upper leadership went over the mountain range and into Yugoslavia. And all the while in Mirdit, over in Rome, you actually had Capitan John Marcojoni with his son Dua orchestrating a further resistance from abroad. From 1947 until 1952, he merged the National Independent Bloc with the National Committee for a Free Albania, working very closely with US CIA as well as British Foreign Intelligence Services, training men in Malta as paratroopers and dropping them right here in their homeland. These men were often seen as incredibly hardcore. They were the special forces of the anti-communist resistance movement, and they continued fighting for years after Lech's death. So Dua Malushi was one of the paratroopers. You can see actually Joe Marku family is right over to the left, and the larger, more influential Joe Markus are buried over here, with Pring Bibdoda right back here.
Sander and my aunt Barda by the house, and that was taken in 1939.
I'll have to take a before and after photo. It's in the exact same place. Wow.
Yeah. And that's them again. Because this was the original entrance to the property. It was a big wooden door here.
In Ottoman style.
Yeah.
Can it see well in low light? No.
No, because you're outside.
Probably.
Like, talk about respect. Respect in some way means, like, you know, knowing like a boundary or a border. And philosophically speaking, what happened here when communism came? Every type of border was just blurred. You don't have any more property. Talk about borders, right?
Look at the outside of the Kula.
Mm-hmm.
You see it here. You can go take your camera and see. So look what they do. Oh, that would never happen back in the day. And this is like, you know, you have all of these institutions and structures or whatever that are supposed to like implement, you know, the protection of like your human rights, which I would say that property is one of them. You know, it's ours. Don't don't build stuff on top of my property. I mean, or don't kill my family, for example. How about that?
There is no property law here.
They blurred the lines for everything here.
The rest of the house, you can see from up here.
Oh, wow.
Way bigger than I realized.
No, look at the garbage we're throwing in the garbage. Yeah, pigs.
The star of the video.
Lucy!
And this church was likewise rebuilt after being destroyed during the atheist era. During this anti-communist insurgency, members of the Mountain Committee killed 2 women who were teachers, and the communists used this as propaganda to foment a wave of anti-Catholic violence all across Mirdit. After this, perhaps seeing that the writing was on the wall, a man named Bard Hawk Biba was killed in 1949. A note was placed in his pocket saying that this was an act committed by the Mountain Committee, whose members then left into Yugoslavia. Now, some of the family historians say that it was more or less an accident that he was killed. It was just an ambush of government vehicles. But I spoke to Bianca, who is the daughter of one of the men involved in the Mountain Committee, and she claimed that he was targeted. He was targeted because he was a distant relative of the family, and because he was a local party representative. He was promoting communism and trying to get it to take root here in his homeland, so they targeted him. After this, over a dozen people were lined up and executed. The communists said they were members of the committee, but they weren't. They were just locals who happened to be in the area. And memorialized next to Marcagione are other anti-communist fighters. I wanted to point out Frok Yeda, who was killed by Albanian communists in 1944. His family has a long history of patriotic tradition. So his father in 1945 and his brother Zefi Geda, they had their home burned down and were imprisoned. They would spend years in prisons. Meanwhile, his other brother, John Geda, was in Yugoslavia, killed by communists there. And buried next to Marcagione is Mansour Dr. Zef Skana, who comes from a very prominent family in Mirdita. He was educated abroad and for 17 years worked in this village to document the resolving of blood feuds and restore religious artifacts. He died in 1943. And behind Marcagione is buried Zef Tucci, an educator, very intelligent man who was a victim of the communist regime, but who survived and died in the year 2000. Can you describe Du John Marku as the leader of the Mountain Committee after the 2 previous leaders had been shot by the Sigurimi?
Due.
Jag kan sagt.
Also,
Nu John Marku.
Due John Marku. Good. So let's say 1944, Albania, let's say, Germans were getting out, the communists were coming, let's say, from southern Albania and closing off northern territories. And in the Albanian history, there's much debate of this. This is an addition from me. There is much debate if this period is to be considered a civil war in Albania between communists and anti-communists, or just, let's say, to be considered as a normal expansion of the Albanian government to the northern Albanians. And I'm one of those who favor the civil war topic. And Ndua was explaining that Ndua John Marku was one of the people who led, let's say, these battles from August to October 1944 with the communists trying to reach north and to enter Mirdit. So Ndua had previously, let's say, had battle experience against the communists. So which these small battles happened in Gzic, in Spal, but mostly near St. Paul. So for the dominance of who to be, let's say, to run the state. After the 26th of October, he went to Shkodër, and that's where they divided their topics, their tasks to do. So Mark and Lesh had to lead the resistance here in Mirdit. And so Ndua left with his father, John, till
John
Italy,
Marcagione.
Rome. So he accompanied his father to Rome.
Edhe
So
ka
he,
shkuar
from there ndue,
ka shkuar
let's
Shtetet
say,
Bashkuara të Amerikës. Ka qenë shtat
from
aktiviteti
there
në
ndue, let's say, after his brother was killed, his brothers were killed. Let's say, took the lead on this committee, but from outside, not from inside of Albania. So, and from Rome, after his father died, he moved to the United States. I think this is what his, let's say, brief history of him.
Capitan John Marcagione died in exile and is still buried in Rome, Italy. Meanwhile, his son Dua continued for 50 years to finance anti-communist activities out of Rome. He returned in 1994 and met his long-lost brother Ded, as well as his sisters Marta and Bardha. It had been 50 years since he'd seen them. Sort of reinvigorated with the spirit of his homeland, he went back to New York, where he authored a revision of the Kanun, the sacred law of the hills, which binds all Albanians through their code of honor, or Besa, and he would pass away not long after this, surrounded by friends and loved ones in New York. And after the killing of Bardhawk Biba, I believe, these men were rounded up and summarily executed, although, according to the family historians, they had nothing to do, at least most of them, with the resistance movement fighting back against Enver Hoxha. I wanted to point out that last time I was here, the family historians didn't really talk too much about the grave here on the right, 2 executions. Now, the reason for this is because it's a little politically unusual. See, the man on the right, Frok Sherry, was one of the main delegates of the National Liberation Council and was very active in this region in 1944. However, after 44, he had some problems with the communist leadership, and because he had friends in the Jomardai family, he was executed without cause in 1946, along with his friend Georgi, in front of their families and friends in the center of the village. His brother Nikoli would spend most of his life in prison camps. He was a nurse, and his other brother, Peter, who had served for the Italians, would die in prison under torture. So Shaban Pelusia briefly led Bali Kombatar.
The Bali Komtar were close, let's say, but just in the periods that Mithat Frashi was leading the party, let's say, Bali Komtar, and in the period that Shevchet Verlatsi was leading Bali Komtar. But the other moments we don't really have much information about what went on, so, or what the relation is.
During Shaban Pelusia's uprising, his men witnessed Serbian partisans burn dozens of Albanian villages. And I'm wondering what kind of massacres were being committed in 1945 by Yugoslav partisans against the Kosovars.
One of the statements from Due is that during those massacres, let's say, 2,000 Kosovo Albanians were imprisoned, were captured by Serbian partisans, and were moved to Tivar, where they were assassinated, all of them.
Montenegro,
Tivar.
Shaban Paluja was born in 1871 in the Drenica region of central Kosovo, long understood as a beating heart of Albanian nationalism. Before he was a young man, he saw his homeland occupied by several different competing world powers, so by the time of the Great War, he fought against Austria-Hungary, and by the 1920s, he had joined with the Kachak movement. Then, by the early 1940s, he decided to fight against Italian occupation and was put in prison. Like most partisan fighters from Albania and Kosovo, Shaban Paluja maintained ties with different units of varying political allegiance. Now, this is because they were not pursuing any particular side during World War II. They only wanted Albanian statehood, and they wanted Kosovo to be incorporated within that Albanian state. He was put in prison, and when he was released, he quickly joined Bali Kombatar, and for a short period of time actually led them. And it was for this 1941 activity against the Italians that he was awarded the title Hero of Kosovo once the country gained independence in 2008. These partisan groups had political ties that reached across the spectrum. Bali Kombatar, in the initial stages of the war, had actually formed a pretty trustworthy alliance with communist partisans. However, as the Germans moved in to occupy Albania, they actually incorporated Kosovo into what they called a Greater Albania, and men like Shaban Paluja saw that the communists were breaking with them and decided to make a firm split. Now they agreed to work with the Germans to destroy the communist Albanian and Yugoslav partisans. A turning point in World War II for the activities of Shaban Paluja revolves around the Battle of Novi Pazar. See, that city is up in Serbia, but Shaban and his supporters, about 60 of them, wanted it to be a part of Greater Albania. So they journeyed up to talk to the German collaborator mayor that ran the community. And while they were there was an offensive by Yugoslav communist partisans. Shaban Paluja took part in the battle, but because they lost, the mayor blamed him and his men for looting, and he and his supporters were arrested in Mitrovica with a large amount of looted materials. Now, naturally, Shaban Paluja and his band said that this was only to requisition materials to support the war effort. And sure enough, as the war went on, he did join with the Yugoslav partisans and continued the fight again, only to support more autonomy for Kosovo. Every time the Yugoslav command ordered him to fight further north, he would turn the offer down, saying, "Now we have Chetniks in Kosovo killing ethnic Albanians. I will not be sent north above Albanian lines because you'll either kill me or while I'm gone, all of my supporters will be massacred." So eventually, in 1945, the Yugoslav military attacked the Albanian partisans under Shaban Paluja, in spite of the fact that he and 8,000 men had been aiding the Yugoslav partisans. This was a betrayal and a massacre, pure and simple. Now, when those Yugoslav partisans double-crossed Shaban Paluja and his partisans, around 8,000 of them, in January 1945, a broader uprising followed in the Drenica region, and about 40,000 Albanians joined in. Dozens of villages were burned, hundreds of people were killed, and Shaban Paluja would be killed in February 1945. In the aftermath of this, the command of those Palusian partisans eventually broke down. They agreed to join with the Yugoslav partisans, but a condition of their joining was that they would be marched up over the mountains and into Montenegro. Now, a fight would ensue between Serb officers and Albanian partisans once they reached the town of Bar, and killing began. Now, it's unknown how many Albanians were killed in the Bar massacres, but it's anywhere from a few hundred to over 2,000. The Yugoslav authorities immediately covered that site with an airport, and pretty much it is unknown within Montenegro or even Kosovo today that this massacre took place. So Shaban Paluja is an incredibly complicated character who only ever saw Albania as the priority of World War II for him. It was not a world war, it was Albania's war.
So they were relocated and killed there.
Masakra e Tivarit kom pri Kosovë deri në Tivar.
Of course, they made them walk from Kosovo
Kjo
to
ka qenë,
till Tivar, and later,
terapia
let's say, it was Nenue is stating that it was a betrayal, let's say, or between Tito and Hoxha. So, let's say, a hidden pact of letting this massacre go.
si nacionalista.
Because they were the people who were captured, even though might have been regular people, they were considered all as nationalists and anti-communists.
Did Xavier Deva ever have contact with the anti-communists in Mirdita after the war, or did anyone you ever know communicate with him?
So till the death of Mark Giomarco in 1946, he had close contacts, let's say, with Mark and those who followed Mark. But after Mark's death, there was no point, let's say, of communication between them.
In April 1948, Marta and Prenda Tarazi were shot, and the communists used this as a reason to oppress Catholics in the region. Can you tell me a little bit about what life was like living in Mirdita at the time?
Terror vetëm në krahinën e Fanit tu,
Just in the village of Fan in those years,
as në kohën e Turkut, as të Serbit, çfarë ka bën komunizmi vetëm të pushkatue këtu.
so Ndu is stating that what communists did throughout those years, killing people just in the village of Fan, more than 30 people will just, let's say, gathered and killed without a trial, just in front of everybody, just to make an example. And if you look at the facts, this is an addition from me. If you look at the facts about, let's say, regions during communism and the number of people killed per 1,000 inhabitants, in Albania, most of the regions, there is 1 or 2 people, 3 most killed for 1,000 inhabitants. Mirdit goes as 17 to 20 people per 1,000 killed by the communists. And this is just in the early days where they started to establish the regime in Albania and trying to enter northern Albania and Mirdita especially.
The Mirdita Executive Committee was formed in 1949 and agreed to spread resistance into Kosovo, I believe. I'm wondering what they actually did in Kosovo and who they worked with.
Not much had been done because at that time the borders between Albania, let's say, and Yugoslavia for the time, and of course Kosovo, because Kosovo was left on the other side, was really tight, and their operations were, let's say, kind of stuck here. Not much could be done there because if you go through the history of Albania as well, 1948, 1949 is when Hoxha starts to cut the relations with the Yugoslavs and join being more pro-Russian, let's say.
S'kan kalue
October 48, 45 anti-communists originally from Mirdit and 3 from his family, 3 people from his family made a crossing in the Hasi region to Kosovo because to flee, let's say, Albania, and they were captured because even though the 2 states didn't have any relations, the security of these two countries was still communicating and still acting, and as they crossed the border, all of them were captured and killed.
Bloku Kombëtar Independent
You said it in Albanian. So.
was established in Italy in 1946. What other groups joined them, and what was their ultimate goal?
Bloku Kombëtar was formed as a continuation, let's say, of Albanians' struggle for independence, let's say, from the anti-communists, let's say, struggle for Albanian independence.
Dhe si qëllim kishte unifikimin dhe bashkëpunimin e të gjitha forcave elitare shqiptare.
And its goal was to let's say, to gather and unify all the elite, let's say, forces and minds who could contribute to this free Albanian, ex-free Albanians.
Dihet John Markagjoni,
There is a close collaboration of Ndue John Marko with
Ernest Koliçi,
Ernest Koliçi,
Shevqet Verlacit
Shevqet Verlaci, who is another figure.
dhe Shanakut.
These are all political figures, let's say, anti-communist
Recep
political
Krasniqi.
figures. All those who Artan is mentioned.
Oroshit, Trojeve Antare.
All, let's say, the intellectuals and all influential people who had left, let's say, Albania, or who were living outside of Albania and had a willing to do something about what was going on here. So let's say Mark, before his death, let's say,
Por
it was hoping to have a close collaboration with the Americans. So we're going back in history with the Americans and the Brits.
me plot gojnë e kanë pre në besh.
But he was, let's say,
Nuk kanë bashkëpunu me ta.
he was, let's say, he was left aside. They didn't support him, didn't cooperate with him. So
Kanë hikë.
Never.
Gjatë losë e kanë bo ata.
let's say, and he thinks this is a follow-up of what happened, what was agreed on the Tehran meeting of Stalin, Roosevelt, I think, and Churchill. So this is this lack of support and lack of, let's say,
I danë zonat e influencës,
where
edhe sigurisht
they divided their zones of
man
influence, and Albania actually was with a question mark in one of Churchill history books. Albania is a question mark. Is the Iron Curtain, let's say.
por
Who would be communists, Democrats, and Albania was with a big question mark in the block of Churchill.
Serbit.
But
Armiku kryesor
the Albanian people, Mark is going a bit out of topic. He's saying that the main troublemakers for the history of Albanians were always the Serbs. So let's say practically in every field, in every moment. So.
Capitan Gjon Marcagioni was working with Italy in the CIA at the time to send paratroopers. Were these the men at the Battle of Zepe?
Disa nga këta që kanë zbritur në Zep, ka qenë betejë e Zepës. Yes, they were.
Bloku Kombëtar Independent.
Yes, they were, because the first operations were coordinated, let's say, by Bloku Kombëtar Independent.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the Battle of Zepe?
Mund të tregoni thot pak më shumë tash thot kanë zbritur?
kanë ardhur me tjerë, po
So two of them are you still filming, right?
Yes.
Two of the figures that, let's say, parachuted to Albania, John Gjinaj and
John Gjinaj edhe Numi Dyshi
and some
shumë të tjerë
and some
që
others.
unë nuk
who their names, most of them, we don't know. You might find them in the documents, mostly.
Kyka organizuje.
Can you tell me a little bit about John Ginai, who's the main fighter at the Battle of Zepe? I believe I've spoken to somebody who said his uncle served with Mark John Marku and overheard him say he trusted Ginai with his life. And he died mysteriously in 1977. I'm wondering the story behind that.
John Ginai was a hero of the Albanian resistance. He was my Uncle Mark's right-hand man. And he parachuted into Albania with some of the missions.
Dulin Oratisen.
They organized, let's say, the troops, or the groups to go in the mountain.
Peter Kadeli.
So it was December 1950, and let's say the security was closing on them, and they were somehow to take shelter in one of the caves, let's say, because it was winter, they needed protection.
Atemani ikara sigurimi ikara.
And in this place, Sigurimi, let's say, found them, tracked them and found them. And a lot of forces came from Kukus, from Tirana, from Shkodër, and let's say it was a big operation against them. In that struggle, 4 people were killed. 4 people from the village of Gjuj. It was badly wounded, John Ginai. He was taken, let's say, from to a house nearby, wounded in that state, and it was covered in leaves of oak tree that was around, just to hide him from the communists who came, searched this place but didn't found him. Let's say in one of the moments was this guy from the Sigurimi, Haidar Tava, was killed, let's say, in a close battle, in a front-to-front battle with one of them. And later he was declared a national hero. There were a lot of people killed also from the Sigurimi, but they don't tell the numbers. They never did. So this was, let's say, the last battle of the anti-communists, let's say, in Mirdit, let's say, the last struggle and after this, a lot followed, so the government practically took control of the whole area.
Can you describe a little bit just about how the battle progressed? It was 450 communists versus 9 men.
So basically, they during the night, the communists were, let's say, took positions around the place, and in the early morning, they started, let's say, the fight. The first one to be killed was Frog Goldoda, who was, let's say, the guard, at the moment, let's say, the person who was taking a guard. It's a really steep place where they were located, so where the cave was located. So basically the whole day went, let's say, giving and taking, exchanging fire, let's say, during the whole day. It went, well, of course, it had small peaks, but basically from morning till when sun went down, I was constantly fighting, let's say, between them. After the struggle, let's say, the battle ended, they took a nearby villager and just killed him for no reason.
The communists?
The communists, of course, the communists.
Yes.
They just killed it for no reason, just because they didn't properly succeed to finish this battle. Just God went on the road and
just evil.
Yeah, just evil, pure evil. So let's say out of these 9, 4 people, let's say, survived this battle.
And the leader of it, Jean Ginai.
He's stating that after this battle, a lot of people around were arrested, let's say. Of course, it's another step of the madness of the regime, but Tani do të pyesë për Jean Ginai.
He was, so Jean Ginai died in New York in 1977. And I believe some of his family think he was assassinated, but I haven't read anything else about that.
He ultimately ended up in New York, so I knew him very well. He used to come to our house all the time. He was a great friend of the family's. And yes, in 1977, it was December, He was murdered, cold-blooded, in New York, in the Bronx. But it's an unsolved mystery. Most people say it was the Sigurimi.
Was he on the streets in his home?
I was walking from work. He was a doorman in a building in the city, and I think he was on his way home, and they just shot him. So it was a hit.
It's mysterious. I can't find any newspaper articles.
No, I know. I've looked through that too, through like cold cases of New York, and I can't find anything either.
So John Gina is from the village of Ndule.
ديال أريد ديال يتم
He was orphaned.
وبون ديال شو ميافت شو مزوتي
He became, let's say, a really tough person, a really capable person who was, let's say, for a lot of years, personal companion of Mark John Mark.
مدد بنوصل
Together with Dod.
أشت coincidence se أجاهم
It's a coincidence
إذا
that
Mark John Mark إيشين من زيرة
his uncle is sharing a story. His uncle and Mark John Mark were sharing an office.
ديال ما ترمي ما بسنك
So John Mark and Johnny,
سمكافدون أجاهم
so let's say he found them in the office and asked his son Mark, why have you taken John Gina as your personal companion? Do you trust him? And Mark said, I trust him with my life. So he's sharing just this small story that his uncle witnessed, let's say, because he was in the office with Mark. I mean, we don't know it for sure. We've heard that he was killed, but we don't have real information or real data about it. So
كان هيستوريت يجدكم
he's describing his character. Let's say he's stating that he was brave, he was proud person, but communists, of course, did what they did. So
Everything I've read about him makes him seem like a hero.
Gjithçka që kam lexuar për historinë e Johnit, e bën duket e jep atë përshkrimin e një njeriu të fortë dhe heroik.
ka emën të shkëlqyshëm
A great name to live by.
Transmit to the socialists in the US my words.
I'll tell them.
That you'll have
Do love it, he just wants to share an opinion of his. Many thanks for you guys and your interest in these topics. From the bottom of his heart, he's thanking you for your interest in these topics, and especially for our area and your deed and these events. As every region has its own histories in Albania or elsewhere.
Por çka histori mirdita, po të thellohen këta,
But what the history of Mirdit is, let's say,
do qenë mrekulli.
You'll find wonders on his, let's say, starting from the fact that for 500 years of Ottoman invasion, we were, let's say, an autonomous area. And what the regime did with Mirdit was brutal and divided it and destroyed it, let's say. So basically Mirdit during communism had the same fate of Albania. So if Albania was in 1912 was divided among other Balkan states, so ethnic Albanian territories, that once the communists stepped in, they reorganized Mirdit, and big parts of it was left to neighboring regions, so to be governed, let's say. And just a small, what is today Mirdit was not entirely. Till 1974, even this region Fan was with Kokos, the neighboring region. It wasn't with Mirdit. So. And even with that, these oppressions of 500 years of Ottoman invasion, modern days, communism, having his heel on Mirdit, Mirdit still managed to preserve certain elements, traditional elements, and to survive to those. It had unique traditions and still preserves them today. And many thanks for your interest. 2000.
Ky ka qenë oti se qunë djali.
Gjovalin.
Po Gjovalin. Ky ka qenë me gur të dhenun. Përpara.
The old grave was
E
with,
komunizmi
with
e ka
stones.
shem, merr me men,
Kanë vominët.
merr me men, komunizmi e ka shem, e ka shu gurt në prut.
So basically, the communists destroyed even his grave, so his upper parts, the stones, and they had to rebuild it in the 2000s, so later, when they had the chance.
Këtu kam vorët e mia unë.
And those are relatives of his family, so nephews to the Mark family. His father, Baba, Awaya?
Kastra gjyshi.
Great
Gjyshi.
grandfather, grandfather, father,
Aja,
aunt,
aja.
and two uncles. Monsignor.
Ti Chevalin.
He is a priest and
Gjyshi hem,
father is a doctor of our area. He's originally from Mirdit.
o
Was buried
o
here.
Chevalin. Për jo, altani ka dhenë për pash me ditës, në lidhën e përzërës, gjyshi hem.
This is
Këto
what,
janë emrat e martirëve të Mirditës.
these are the names of the martyrs of Mirdit, one of group of martyrs.
Në përgjithësi të gjithë janë zhdu.
Most of them are vanished, let's say,
Nga periudha e 1924
killed, vanished from 44 till
deri në 49.
till 49. So
Ndërta,
among them,
shumë nga këta nuk kanë eshtra. Nuk
there is no
kanë
grave
varë.
to commemorate them.
Po pllaka memorialit është vënë në shpal për arsye se trupat e tyre diku këtu rrotullin herë.
This plaque with their names is placed here in Spal because it is believed that their bodies were thrown around here, so during that time.
Memoriali është bë në çaj respekti për bashkëluftëtarët nga Fondacioni Sarajeti Kapitan Gjon Markagjoni.
So the plaque was placed by the foundation that is led by.
Është rindërtuar sepse i pari ka qenë degradim e sipër.
It's a late rebuild because the old one was and hopefully there can be searches that can find some of the remains, let's say, of the bodies of some of them that might be buried around here.
Trupi I ndjerit Kapitan Lezhë Gjomarku,
The body of the deceased Captain Lezhë Marku.
mendohet të jetë fshet diku në territoret e Shpalit.
It is believed to be somewhere in the vicinity of down there of those pine trees down there.
Ashtu si edhe trupi I
Maybe
vëllë.
you want to go a bit closer. As also the body of the other person. The people that were killed in this massacre that followed the death, the killing of Bardock Biba, some of their bodies are, some of the persons are buried in a single grave, which is here in the graveyard, and we'll have a chance to visit it, to see it.
Can you explain a little bit about the killing of Bardock Biba?
The killing of Bardock Biba happened in Chav Valmir, which is was on the old road that used to go through Mirdit. So this is why the main, always the main road since antiquity times has been through this valley, through these steps, and Chav Valmir, where the killing happened, is let's say a passing point in the main road.
Komitetit Maleve.
Many believe that it was an encounter by chance, not let's say not an asked confrontation. It was just by chance that they met up in that road. Bardock was accompanied by two close, let's say, bodyguards that followed him. The gentleman named the gentleman, and one of them was a close cousin to him.
Nuk mendoj se ka qenë ndjekje.
He doesn't believe that he was being followed, let's say, by the anti-communists. It was pure chance, let's say, that they encountered heaven. Because they had many chances, the Committee of the Mountains, so the anti-communists, they had many chances before that to even kill him, so or to make an ambush and kill him. So they had many other occasions, and they never did it.
Këtë vrasje Partia e Punës, Partia Komuniste.
this killing, the Communist Party
e ka përdorur për të nënshtruar
used it to submit the region itself.
të gjitha familjet me përbërje
And mainly
antikomuniste.
the big families who had anti-communist elements, in the groups in the mountains or in different areas. Because this can be seen, it can be proven because except the killings of the 17th of August
Të gjitha
of
familjet
1949, all the families
e antikomunistëve janë internuar dhe burgos.
all the families of anti-communist people who were in the mountains fighting, their families were taken into internment camps, southern Albania, or imprisoned. So.
Prangvi Doda.
And I guess the final question, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about modern American politics and what your message to the world is as people who've lived through communist Red Terror.
Pyetje jashtëzakonshme.
An extraordinary question. When the Communist Party was established in Albania,
Një nga aktorët e kryesor Kemal Stafa.
one of the main characters of this was Kemal Stafa, a young guy, a young communist from Shkodra, who was, let's say, founded with support of the Yugoslavs.
I thotë
So let's say the communists divided their tasks, and in an encounter with one of his uncles,
Ozef
Kemal Stafa told his uncle.
kishin kryer gjimnazin klasik të Shkodrës edhe
They studied
njifte.
together in Shkodër, and they know each other.
E një parashitet ti shevike,
And he tells him that they
edhe
founded
do
the
me
Communist
pije
Bolshevik Party, let's say.
njëti kapitanit,
And you are
njëti
a
Gjon
nephew
Margazionit,
to the capitans of Mirdit.
je shkollum, intelektual,
You're
do me të formu
educated
partinë komuniste në Mirdit.
educated, and we want to establish the Communist Party in Mirdit as well.
I thotë Ajem ma
His
e
uncle
programin.
says that give me to see the program of this party.
E tregojnë program, janë gjitha.
So my support is to the American,
Ka dy parti.
to let's say to the American vision. So
Është qeveria
free property,
Saktë.
free rent, not the Bolshevik
I thot pra,
nonsenses that.
në qoftë se unë do t'jem gjallë, unë do të ha kokën.
And Kemal states to
Ti-
his uncle, if I'm still alive, let's say during the war or after, I'll kill you.